All right, let's get started. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Your Home in the Electrical Grid. My name is Zach Snyder. I am with the nonprofit Solar Oregon, and we are super excited to have you here today. This is an event that I've been looking forward to for a little while, and we have a very special guest speaker. So at Solar Oregon, just to kind of hook us all, we talk a lot about energy in the context of your home, and that includes, of course, solar, also some related technologies like efficiency, electric vehicle charging, energy storage. And one of my favorite things about doing what I do is that there is so much to know about the electrical grid. It's almost crazy. As someone once said, professor at Western Kentucky University, the grid is the most complex machine that humans have made. And I think in a lot of ways that's true. And so this event is where we are going to branch out and start to look outside of the context of just the home and talk a little bit about the grid. And so a couple of leading questions that we might kind of dance around today include, why does changing when you use electricity matter? If your home uses both rooftop solar and electricity from the grid, how do you maximize the use of your solar energy? How can energy storage help with this? And in the big picture context, what does the utility company need to consider when they're planning future expansions or upgrades to the electrical grid? And so we are joined by Sherrie Villmark at Community Energy Project. I'll give an introduction here in just a second. And Sherrie really is the agenda today. So I'm going to share just a couple words at the beginning, and then we'll have a little Q&A at the end. Quickly, Solar Oregon, our nonprofit, is focused on education and outreach. We've been around for over 40 years. We have workshops on how to go solar and storage for home and business owners. We put on tours, solarized campaigns. So definitely check out the things we have going on. Just a few other events in this very packed June. We have a few showcases. So we like to show off interesting sites around the state. So you can learn from the folks who created them, about why they created them, what it was like, the incentives they received, the technology, things like that. So please join us. The next one is on Monday, this next Monday on the 20th, Bethlehem Inn, very interesting nonprofit in Bend, Oregon. Then on the 21st, we have Kellogg Middle School. These two are virtual, so anyone can join from anywhere the following day. And then we have an in-person event in Southeast Portland at the New Day School, which is a neo-humanist preschool that went zero energy when they retrofitted their school recently. So that should be really interesting. It's also just a really beautiful site. So check out our website. I'm going to put just a few links in the chat, and that includes a link to our website, our events, and also Energy Trust of Oregon. And speaking of Energy Trust of Oregon, Energy Trust of Oregon is supporting this webinar today. So a huge thanks. They're an independent nonprofit. They do a lot in the state regarding clean and affordable and efficient use of energy. They provide incentives. They support great education like this. So thanks to them. I would like to kick us off with just a couple of polls to get some information about who you all are. And just a note that during the webinar, we will answer some questions at the end. If you could use the Q&A box for that and not the chat, though, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say hi, even chat with other folks in the chat. I'm going to launch the first poll here, which is just asking where you're tuning in from, whether that is Portland, Oregon, elsewhere in the Willamette Valley, Oregon coast, etc. So just take a second and fill that out. All right, gonna wrap this up. Thank you. And one other poll before we get started is a quick demographics poll, completely optional, but much appreciated. All right, I'll just give a couple more seconds. All right, thank you. So I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Sherrie Villmark. Not the first time that Sherrie has joined a Solar Oregon webinar, so really great to have you back. Sherrie's a program director at the nonprofit Community Energy Project that does a lot of great work. And Sherrie oversees the Community Education and Advocacy departments there. She has nearly 20 years of experience in a variety of community education approaches, including environmental interpretation, voter education, skill building, public speaking, consulting, and advocacy with decision makers. Additionally, she has over 15 years of experience in program development and design, from small workshop programs to low-income component of the Oregon Community Solar Program, which has had a lot of fanfare over the past couple of years. So welcome, Sherrie. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and let you share your screen.
Great. Yeah, I think all the other times I've spoken to y'all, it's been about community solar.
Yeah.
Excited to talk about something else, as much as I love talking about community solar. Today, we're going to talk about what is commonly referred to as distribution systems planning. What is the basics of what that means? This is a pretty hot topic. And then did the slide advance, Zach?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So as Zach mentioned, a little bit about us is our mission is basically that we believe everybody deserves a safe, healthy, and efficient home, regardless of their income. So our forte is working with low-income folks and frontline communities. Today, I'm going to talk about the basics of how the grid works and how that works with what's called peak load, how natural disasters affect the grid, and get into what are called distributed energy resources, which is a really major component of DSP. So distribution systems planning. Basically, right, we're talking about like the way energy is distributed. If you think about, there are 3 stages of energy production and distribution. You have like generation, like big utility style generation, whether it's a wind farm or a coal plant or whatever. And then you have transmission, which is moving that energy from where it's generated into neighborhoods. And then there's distribution, and that happens at the substation level. So once it hits the substation, distribution gets a lot more complicated. And I'll go into that. But what has to happen is a great deal of intensive planning has to be done to think about the grid, 10 years, 15 years, even 20 years in advance from now, as energy needs are continually changing. So this is the old way that the grid worked. You had your fossil fuel power plants for the most part. You had your power plants, transmission, distribution, your home. One-way flow of power, which meant you had really one way of doing everything. And it really limited the amount of interaction that customers had. Like basically a customer was a consumer of electricity. Now it's a lot more complicated than that, because now you not only have fossil fuel plants, you have renewable energy, you have utility level storage that's happening, transmission and distribution. You can see the arrows are going 2 directions now, because we ourselves as customers are starting to affect the grid. We're electrifying our own transportation with electric vehicles. We have, solar panels, we have home battery storage. We're making energy efficiency decisions in our homes. There's even microgrids, and demand response is something I'm going to go into as well. So I'm going to dig into several of these options and how it affects the grid and how utilities have to plan around those things. One thing about renewables is, so the grid has to be perfectly balanced. I believe it's every 4 seconds, 4 or 6 seconds. The grid has to be perfectly balanced so that if you didn't have enough energy, right, you have brownouts and blackouts. And if you have too much energy, you have transformer explosions and different issues. And so renewables are a little extra complicated, because unlike a coal fire plant where you shovel coal in a certain amount and it produces the amount of energy, it's very man controlled. Mother Nature has her own rules. Wind blows when it blows, the sun shines when it shines. And so it makes the balance also like really complicated. And this is where we come into peak demand. So if you think about this peak is when everybody's using the most energy at the same time. So if you picture you go to work, let's pretend, or pre-COVID, everyone's at work and you're all sharing certain resources, right? You're all sharing the same lights and the same heat, the same air conditioning together. But then you all come home, everybody comes home and they start cooking dinner and taking showers and turning on the TV and maybe running a load of laundry or maybe running the dishwasher or whatever. And everybody's doing this, and you have this peak event that happens, and it varies by time of year. So peak times, May through October, right? This is our summertime peak, is 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. as a general rule. That's when we're using the most energy altogether. And the entire grid has to be able to accommodate that peak event. Even if that peak event only happens for an hour a year, everything has to be able to accommodate that. And what happens is if peak events get higher and higher, more and more dirty energy tends to come on, because dirty energy or fossil fuels, I should say, be more objective. Fossil fuels come online because they can be responsive, right? You can fire up a gas plant, you can fire up a coal plant like immediately. So peak demand is something we actually really want to have some control over, right? Because building that new plant to produce energy a small amount of time also increases rates. If you're building an entire plant to accommodate 1 hour that happens once during a heat dome, right? Like for example, and you want all that power to stay on, then that's also going to make energy less affordable. And we want to be part of what DSP is about is stakeholders being able to be involved in the process so that utilities can make wise decisions. So even like hydroelectric dams, for example, went in and it displaced indigenous people. It ruined a lot of subsistence lifestyles. There was no compensation. People were left out of conversations, and thus people were hurt by decisions in the past. And so this is stuff that we are not interested, stakeholders at the table don't want to see this sort of thing repeated again and again. And we also see the, one of the things that changed was Boardman Power Plant was shut down, right? And look, it was burning 5.5 tons of coal per minute. It would power 500,000 homes. But thinking about like everything from the amount of carbon being produced by that kind of intensive burning and the coal being shipped, shutting it down, was a win for environmentalists. But then we also have to think about, well, how are those 500,000 homes going to be powered, right? You can't just take something away. It needs to be replaced with something new and something consistent. And then, of course, we have climate change. The climate crisis exacerbates all of these kinds of issues, right? We don't have to think back very far before we're looking at smoke events and wildfires that actually can burn the grid itself I mean, you have like two things, right? With drought and intense wildfire, you have the power systems themselves can catch fire, and you also have had preemptive shutoffs of power for weeks in some areas because antiquated systems can cause fires, or like the, system. Some of these systems were built over 100 years ago, and they had very different factors they had to worry about. And of course, we have smoke inhalation, which can be serious or deadly. And I'm going to loop back around to why I'm mentioning that as well. And then, of course, winter storms, same thing, right? We had these power outages. And unfortunately, you have power outages that's going out at the exact wrong time when we have extreme temperatures. And we lost people here in Oregon to this. And we also, and a lot of people, Texas was kind of famous for this too. They lost quite a few people in their winter storms as well. Then we're also looking at drought, which is changing. We have a lot of hydroelectricity on our grid. It's a major source of power for us. And how is drought going to affect the amount of power we can expect from hydroelectric dams? And when there's a lot of pressure put on fish, like salmon, for example, parts of the dam have been shut down in the past to help ease pressure put on aquatic wildlife. So I'm actually going to skip this slide. Sorry about that. One of the other things is around increasing need. So we've got, already like in the utility planning system, right? You've got these natural events, disasters that are happening more and more frequently. And it's like, okay, how are those things accommodated? And then you've got, population growth. There's been a big push for electrification and getting off of gas. There's retiring of fossil fuel plants such as Boardman. And, we're looking at like, how do we electrify our transportation? Because we're in a climate crisis. And so how's that done? So we're seeing an increase of need as well. I know in my neighborhood, I got a house just went in on the same grid, right? We're all using the same substation and the same feeder line, and a whole bunch of houses are coming in, little houses. And then I'm seeing people get electric vehicles more and more. So their need is going up. Excuse me. So one of the things, some of the stuff that stakeholders are talking about is like, well, what happens with people that can't afford this? What about renters who have little control over efficiency and appliances? How do we make sure that this energy movement, these new movements, are equitable and fair for everybody? And this is where we come into distributed energy resources, or DERs. I don't know who named them, but that's where we're at. Engineers probably. So DERs actually include four things. There's renewable energy and battery storage, energy efficiency, smart technology, and electric vehicles are actually a part of this as well. But I'm lumping them in with smart technology, and I'll show you why. So the first one is energy, renewable energy and storage. So y'all know, right? We have daily fluctuations that happen, and the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day, but the sun also doesn't necessarily shine, and the wind doesn't necessarily blow when we need power the most. We have those happening daily, and then seasonally we have this as well. In fact, here's a shot of an old shot of my solar panel, like energy use, which is in the pink, how much energy I was using. And you can see where an ice storm covered up my solar panels and I produced nothing. And the green shows the production. So there's also like, I'm using a lot of energy in January, but I'm not getting a lot of solar production in January because the sky is low and I have a neighbor with a tall roof or a tree, whatever. There's all kinds of reasons why there are these seasonal fluctuations as well. So one of the big pieces that's really important here when we're thinking about peak time, peak load, and how we want to like lower that peak, we want to go from mountain to like little hill. Batteries is one of the huge elements as to how this can be helpful. So while we have energy use, there's a peak in the morning and a peak in the evening, and the sun is shining beautifully right in the middle of all of that for a lot of the year. What we can see is, well, instead of having all that solar just dumping onto the grid, it can go into batteries. And then you can dispel the battery in the evening And that lowers like the evening peak, right? Because if everybody's using batteries, then that evening peak is a lot lower. And it's a great way to be a lot more, brings a lot of reliability and control to what nature is gifting us all the time. And at the utility level, right, they're doing this. They're looking at this. How can we have wind and solar and storage all on big, big scales at the utility level? They're a part of it as well. There are also microgrids, opportunities, and community resilience as well. And this was an example of where community can gather, where solar panels and batteries are like powering people, and they can get gas, and they can get is sensitive medical equipment sometimes requires electricity, and sometimes people need that to be really constant. So electricity for some people is not just a luxury, it is a necessity. But coming down into like home resilience, right? Like we're talking about being able to have everything from continued communication and medical equipment to heating and cooling, and even running elevators. If you have mobility issues and you can't take stairs, you are trapped on the second, third, fourth, or higher floor of an apartment complex if the power goes out. You have no way of leaving the building, even if you should be, say, in the case of impending fire. And then, you know, we're looking at like, how are communities energy resilient? So in the distribution systems planning process that we're currently in, I've been mostly involved with PGEs, but each utility is having them. This is the question PGE is asking right now. Like, how do we decide who gets what? Which communities have the greatest need? And when we're talking about, say, solar and storage, there are equity considerations to have. Do you, say the example we went through this morning, do you have a big battery that if the grid goes down for some reason, this 5 blocks get served? Or do you say, well, we want to focus on all the people who have medical equipment that has to have electricity, and we want to make sure that they're getting batteries and their solar and storage so that those people are taken care of? And what's the right combination of things when it comes to solar and storage, and what are the barriers to having them, from home ownership to repairs? And these are questions where, like, you know, utilities are not used to thinking about the grid in this way. So we all want to be a part of it. There are wonderful non-energy benefits to having solar and storage. And then there's energy efficiency, one of my personal favorites. I probably shouldn't say that in this room, but I love energy efficiency. And what we were talking about with energy efficiency.
You love it too.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Is that you're using less energy to get the same results. That's basically the easy definition of energy efficiency, right? And this would include things like weatherization, air sealing, insulation, this sort of thing. It can also include appliance replacement and things like that, but our focus here is going to be on weatherization. So the great thing about efficient homes is they're working 24/7, 365. So the more homes that are weatherized, the more you're going to curb that peak event, right? And there are all these wonderful things that when you live in a well-weatherized home, you save money individually, and right, then also at the utility scale because of the curbed peak. And of course, there's carbon footprint reduction that comes from simply using less of whatever it is you are using. And when it comes to resilience in extreme temperature events, so this is a thermal shot of these windows. Red means heat is escaping into the outside. And we have these 2 bright red windows. And then over on the left, there's 2 more green windows where less heat is escaping. That's simply plastic and windows. Not even the difference. That is plastic acting as an insulation barrier. So when the power goes out, and power is going out more and more frequently as our infrastructure ages more and more, when the power goes out and it's extremely cold out or extremely hot out, who is more exposed to dangerous temperatures? Again, this is where we come into equity, but also like we're looking a solution like right in the face, right? efficient homes maintain temperatures and they maintain air quality. In the smoke events that we had, people with really strong air sealing got to breathe cleaner air inside their homes than people without. So they're safer and they're more comfortable as well. And comfort is something we should be able to equate with our homes. And so this is like in thinking about distribution systems planning, again, like these big questions of who's most likely to have an efficient home, who has control over the efficiency of their home, and what are the consequences. In the heat dome, what was that last year? We lost over 100 Oregonians lost their lives. And it was a lot of people who were very low income, a lot of seniors, a lot of people in multifamily housing. So what do we do to prevent that in the future? And then we have smart technology. This is called a lot of things. I've heard it called like 3 or 4 different names by utilities. Flexible load is one of them, and I'm spacing on the other terms. But this is smart appliances that understand peak load and can change things accordingly, right? That grid has to be perfectly balanced, and smart technology can help us maintain these balance. So, sorry, it's a bad asthma day for me. So smart technology can be things like thermostats. So this is looking at, so let me come back to Texas for a minute, because it's fun to pick on Texas. So you had part of what happened in Texas was that it got extremely cold and you had homes that weren't meant for cold. Everybody turns up their heat, right? They're like, oh my God, I'm cold. I'm turning up my heat. And so everybody turned up their heat. Demand skyrocketed. It went past the peak, became higher than the grid could handle, and it collapsed. Everybody lost power. Imagine, God, sorry. Imagine a situation where instead of that happening, everybody's thermostat was adjusted down to like 65 degrees. It's not comfortable, right? You're gonna have to put on a sweater, but everybody could have maintained power. That's a really simplistic way of thinking about it. But I think it illustrates the point in that, like, if everybody shaves off a couple of degrees during peak events, everybody could have had power and everybody's lives could be saved, right? We would have had a lot more people who were uncomfortable but doing better. This also attaches to water heaters, so that your water heater, instead of heating up the water at peak events, like it waits. You know, you take a shower in the morning and you have your hot water, but then your replacement hot water is happening during noon, maybe when your solar panels are the most active. And also the same with electric vehicles. You come home, you're plugging in your vehicle at peak time. But maybe fine, you plug it in at peak time, but your electric vehicle waits until 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night to begin charging. And so it's charging during non-peak hours. And it's a way to make sure that we're having this electrified transportation in the most sustainable way. So this demand management, that's the other term for it, smart technology. They call it demand management and flex management. So it's an important aspect to keeping the power infrastructure strong. But one of the pieces that CEP has run across, because we've installed smart technology for people, is not everybody has access to things like Wi-Fi or the internet at all. The digital divide is a really real issue for some of our most vulnerable people, and some of the people who would benefit greatly from smart technology because, say, you're part of an incentive program. A lot of utilities offer incentive programs that say, hey, if you use most of your power during non-peak time, you get bill discounts on that. When is peak happening? When are alerts happening? We're so dependent on things like emails and smartphones and text messages and having the internet to be able to do that. So this is a barrier that we're discussing in the DSP space as well. Oh. All right. I blew through that all very quickly, but I wanted time
That was great.
I wanted time to be able to ask questions or answer questions that people have. Yeah, you like my IBM PC? Yeah, I thought that was a nice nice illustration of the digital divide there.
Yeah, is that your personal PC?
No.
No.
I had something like that in the 90s, I
Yeah.
feel, but
Yeah.
probably had an HP.
Yeah. Well, Sherrie, that was a ton of awesome info. We do already have some questions in the Q&A. So yeah, that's just, opens my mind in a ton of different directions. So thank you. And so, yeah, let's hit the Q&A now. And if you have questions, again, the Q&A, there's a button on the bar and you can just type your question in there and we'll get to it. So don't hold back. And Sherrie, do you want me to read them, or do you have the window? I'm happy to read them to you.
Let's see. I've got the window here. One is asking how many attendees there are. And it looks like there's 19. Are you advocating for residents to change from gas to electricity? So Community Energy Project has actually written a paper on this. We do support electrification. That is my organization's stance, but that is not everybody's stance. And I know that Northwest Natural has been very vocal about renewable natural gas, which is something that I personally need to learn more about. But I would say that distribution systems planning is not really about electrification. The reason I brought it up, I think the part that probably triggered the question is that there is an enormous push for electrification that's happening across multiple legislative places, and electrification just like from transportation to some people are pushing customers to get off gas. We may see just increased demand in electricity that's coming. Does that answer your question, Tony?
Hopefully. Okay. Feel free to add a follow-up question in the Q&A. I'm kind of curious, I guess the part that caught my attention was focusing on, your in terms of the peak load. You have kind of the peak of when everybody's consuming electricity in the morning, also in the afternoon, and the sun kind of fits right between there. And what a battery can do. And obviously batteries are expensive. Obviously that's changing too. But I'm wondering if you like how can we think about these ways in which there are technologies that work for us in certain ways, they also have a cost for us in certain ways, and how to prioritize that and kind of being a good electrical citizen, right? Because you talked about smart technology too. And there's a lot of, it's complex. So that's a very open-ended question, but I guess with batteries specifically.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that one of the, I would say a really major component of equity in this conversation is that there are benefits to be had and there are prices to be paid. There's no perfect panacea here. There's no silver bullet that's one single thing that's going to solve everything. Solar panels have a price, wind has a price, everything has a price. And so first you're looking at, okay, well, what's the lowest price and who pays it? And if benefits are going to be out there, who is having them? And in the DSP conversations that we're having with utilities, like the way that utilities like traditionally did stuff was they're like, oh, here's a substation. And this is the example that we've been walking through with people in our non-technical workshop. Here's a substation. It can no longer handle the amount of capacity, the amount of energy that's needed to serve its area anymore. So we're going to have to spend $20 million to upgrade it. And we got to put in volt VAR management. We got to put in all these things, and it's on the grid, and it isn't really about the customer, like except in the rate increase that comes from you. $20 million comes from somewhere, right? With distribution systems planning is to say, now, wait a minute. What if we spent that $20 million differently? What if instead of replacing the substation, we talked about customer involvement? What if it was you weatherize 1,000 homes and install 1,000 smart thermostats, and you install 100 solar panel installations with batteries, and then you install a utility level battery to keep to keep an area's power on if power tends to go down here or there more frequently? Where does that battery go? Which customers get those benefits? And who decides? And this is the kind of stuff that's being wrestled with right now, right? Like, who does decide that? How do you bring the right people to the table to represent that community? Because the answer in the Eastport Plaza substation on 82nd and Holgate may be a totally different answer than something in North Portland or outside of Portland, in the suburbs, because the needs of the community are going to be different. So where we're at is to try and find like these formulas, so to speak, like to say, well, one, how do you engage with the right communities and the right community-based organizations? And how do you involve customers around complicated topics so that they can make really informed recommendations, and they can advocate for themselves and their neighbors and their communities, so that we can have like these win-win situations. Because we've seen low-income people, people of color, frontline communities are extremely invested. They're environmentalists. They are more like low-income people, right, are more likely to say that global warming is a serious issue, that climate crisis is a serious issue, that air and water quality are serious issues than middle-income people are. Like, that's what the studies say. And it's that way with developed and undeveloped, like in different internationally as well. Lower income countries have huge investment in this, but what they don't have is huge opportunity and huge recognition. So we're able to say like, hey, like you can save polar bears, you can save energy, you can save money, all in the same go. And if you don't have access to the money, like batteries, I mean, brought up, right? Batteries are expensive. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the power company could say, okay, we'll cover 80% of your battery cost, or you can lease a battery from us, have the power stability, right? Have all those benefits, but not have to pay for upfront, or not have to pay for all of it? Or how can we get different programs? How can we get groups like PCEF, like different funding sources involved to help us, like get where we need to go? And maybe it doesn't all fall on rates.
Yeah, so a lot at play. And on the topic of these public workshops, right, and giving input, it feels to me, I mean, this is it's so complex. There's so many different ideas. How do you, as someone who maybe doesn't know a whole lot about the grid, show up and think about it? And how can you start to think personally about this question? Can you find information? Do you know if you can find information about your specific grid and the needs of your local area, or is it kind of more open-ended than that?
I'd say this is why it's important to bring a lot of different kinds of expertise to the table. This is a place where legislators and advocates come to the table, because they're going to be looking at, well, what we're offering is legislative, like what are the laws, what are the rules, what's the return on investment calculations, what does it mean to have, how are you defining costs, is one, right? We've talked, I'm sure you guys have heard about things like the social cost of carbon. Like, well, it's not cost effective to do this because we're not paying for like the asthma and climate crisis and species extinction and things like that caused by burning coal, for example, right? That's why the costs don't flesh out. Or looking at the costs of preventing serious illness or disaster. And that's their spot. I would say, me as CEP coming to the table, it's around program design. Like, how are you reaching folks? What are the barriers to participation? How can we lower them? And then I don't know, me personally, it's like I have solar panels. So I actually have way more insight into my energy use than before I had them, because I'm able to log into an app that tells me.
Yeah. Great. Well, we have another question here in the Q&A. Dag is asking, when and how do we get utilities to support solar and storage on buildings and accelerate electrification?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I would say being part of the distribution systems planning process is exactly where we're at. So it's like because right now you have a utility that's saying, hey, we've got this problem, this $20 million problem. What would you guys like to see us do with that? If we have this budget, so to speak, and it's not quite that simple, but it's like, yeah, we've got this problem. How do we do that? And if stakeholders are coming out in a big way, being like, hey, solar and storage is the way to go, it's complicated, right? So if you have a peak load that's happening in the summer and the peak load is in the evening when the sun is much lower in the sky, solar panels by themselves might not be the best answer because you'd have to install 10 times as many of them to get your peak load solar. That's why batteries are such an important part of the conversation, because peak load tends to happen when solar production gets lower. So a lot of it is that, PGE and, these utilities are, being told and basically, hey, you have to open this up to hear what the priorities of the communities are. So if the community is saying, yo, like solar and storage, that's the way to go. We have too many power outages. We have people with a lot of medical equipment here. We got a lot of people with disabilities here. We've got these issues. Then that does put pressure on the utilities to take that approach. But the community may come out and say something different. It may not come out with what this group wants. That they may come out with, we want a lot of insulation in homes because we had people die from the last heat event and we want to make sure that their homes stay cooler more easily. Or we want to talk about ductless, or we want to talk about heat pumps because that provides air conditioning for people who desperately need it. So different communities are going to have, I'm suspecting, are going to have very different priorities.
And I'm just going to keep going since we don't have Q&A questions, but still feel free to put them in. How does this relate? Because in some places you have time of use rates that are have a strong price signal so that you're incentivized to shift when you use power, and batteries are a great way to do that. And so in those places, California, you can get some money back from your investment in the battery. Maybe it's a slow payback, but it's a way to offset some of that cost. In Oregon, there are some time of use, right, with PGE, but what can you kind of walk us through that and what maybe some potential is, and also the smart battery pilot too, and things that are kind of like in the mix right now?
So I know that in distribution systems planning, depending on behavior is really tricky because, for example, if you've got a lot of turnover in a home. So let's say you've got an apartment complex and the person's like, yeah, I've signed up for this rebate program and I got my smart thermostat and I allow the utility to control it and it helps do peak. And you've got, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people all doing this, right? We're all shaving a little bit off the peak. But those people move, right? And do their replacement people even know what the heck, peak is, or why their thermostat is adjusting itself, or are they willing to sign up the new agreement for things like that? So there's stuff where it's like behavior, I think, comes with education. I mean, I'll say personally, like I learned about peak load and I was like, oh, and I'm a lot more sensitive to it now. I think about it when I run my dryer. I'm like, I'll just wait a couple of hours, right? Like, I feel like for me, it stuck with me really strongly as like, oh, this is a way I can help the environment simply by turning this button 3 hours later. Like that's really compelling. So I think that can be really compelling to a lot of people. But then you have situations where people don't have control. They aren't going to be able to get a battery. They're not going to be able to get solar panels. They live in multifamily housing. So what are opportunities for them as well? And you have, I believe Multnomah County, we're looking at urban density, right? Like as our populations grow and grow and grow, we may have climate migrations where more people come here. Where are they all living? It's not single family housing. Single family housing can't accommodate that. And so I know that a lot of plans are looking at up to 80% of people living in like multifamily housing in the next 20 years. So it's like, if you're leaving out people in that living situation, then you're passing up really big opportunity. And this is where I'm like, hey, if you put smart thermostats for 1,000 renters in multifamily housing all at once, and you can provide free internet or really reduced cost internet so that all that smart technology can work, that could be something that's, really, really effective and compelling. And it's,
Sherrie,
I think this just kind of depends.
You thought about running for office?
No.
No.
I'm too.
That's a good platform.
I mean, too foul-mouthed to run for office. I'd be busted very quickly. But yeah, I'm also just kind of like glancing in the chat here. I know it's not in Q&A, but also like we are looking, I see this latest one brings up maintenance as well. So this is a piece when we brought up with PGE, I'm like, look, if you're going to say you're going to do a mix of thermostats, energy efficiency, and solar and storage, and say the community says we want you to prioritize low-income housing. I'm like, you're going to have things that are in the way of that. Repairs. Is the roof in decent condition? Is the electrical even up to code? Like, you can't even weatherize, you can't even blow insulation if they've got knob and tube wiring, like their knob and tube wiring to consider. And if there's a roof leak, you have to repair the roof. So understanding that solar inverters crap out after a while. They don't last as long as solar panels. So who pays for that upgrade, and who pays for those repairs, and how is that paid for? And that needs to be a part of every conversation when it comes to working with vulnerable communities, because they are starting in a much deeper hole automatically a lot of times. And especially we work with a lot of seniors, that have been in housing for a long time. And after a while, you're like 90, don't get up on your roof and clean out the gutters to make sure that the leaves aren't piling up. Like, that gets more and more and more dangerous.
Well, this has been incredibly interesting. I think let's go ahead and wrap it up with just the thought of, okay, if something here caught your attention, and you want to move, what are the next things that people can do? Learn more? Where can they, reach out? Where can they get involved? Things like that.
Yeah, it's a little, it's interesting because right now, all of the utilities, well, I shouldn't say all because I'm not involved with all of them. I know at least Pacific Power and PGE, and maybe Northwest Natural, they have public monthly distribution systems planning meetings that people are allowed to go to. They are in the midst of the workday. They're very long. They're very technical. I don't know how helpful they are. I mean, when I went to them, I'm like, I don't know what this means, which was why we worked with PGE to create a non-technical workshop series so that we can take all this really complicated engineer language and translate it into something that a normal human being that's not an engineer and not an expert can understand. But I know that, like I said, I'm most familiar with PGE's program. PGE is looking at like, how do we crack this open? And I think where we've been advising them, I'm like, it would be nice to have themes. So like, if you were to say, hey, what would it look like to have a solar and battery storage theme, and have work groups to talk about what that program could look like? People in this room would probably be a lot more interested in that than a large overall, like, here's distribution systems planning, and you're going to hear about water heaters for half an hour, heat pump water heaters, and how long they last, and how long a transformer lasts, which lasts a lot longer than I thought, to be honest. But like, there's just a lot of stuff that's, you're like, do I need to know this? As opposed to something that's thematic and within your area of interest and expertise. So what I've suggested to PGE, and it'll be up for them to take it or not, is to say, hey, have some themes on energy efficiency. Let's talk about funding, not only a project, but time for community-based organizations to be compensated for their expertise. Like, If you're kind of treating CBOs as a consultant, nonprofits as a consultant, then you maybe need to pay them as you would a consultant. So what does that look like? And where do you have funding for that? And how do you really make use of people's time? So I don't have a very clear answer for you, Zach, on how to get involved. I do know that this calendar year, PGE though is planning to crack open their distribution systems planning process and try to get more players. I've also suggested that you call it something else, like non-wire solutions and demand energy resources and demand response and distribution systems planning. What does that mean to anybody? So I think that even translating what has been long internal engineer focused, like expert language, doesn't really grab attention or make you realize anything's relevant to you. Because I can say, honestly, I saw DSP and I'm like, what does this have to do with me? How is this helping me serve low income people? I don't get it. And it took me a while to realize that, oh, we do have a dog in this fight. There is relevancy to what's happening here. And utilities need to be part of solutions and working with communities, because communities have so much to offer. And are aching to participate in bold and grand and innovative ways. They just need the opportunities to do so. So I'm hoping that y'all will see some of these thematic kind of workshops coming out that's going to invite people with different, with different availabilities as well. Like, some people might 9 to 5 works great, and some people need hours outside of that. Y'all are here on your lunch break, so like what can that look like too?
Great. Yeah, I guess we're kind of wading into the deep end, but thank you for being the one in the room and kind of charting the land for us. Obviously, this is super important, and so it's great to talk through a lot of this. And thank you so much for joining us and sharing all this with us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everybody who's so active.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining. This is recorded, so this will be up on our YouTube, and we'll share that out over email later today. All right. Thanks again, Sherrie. Take care.
Great. Have a good one.